Hi, this is Stan. Welcome back to the shop. Hey, our topic this week is this little jig that I made. It's a do-it-yourself waist side cut jig for a track saw, in this case, the Kreg track saw. So if that sounds interesting, hope you can stay tuned. Well, I think most of you are familiar with the track saw at this point. How the track saw works is that the saw, in this case a plunging saw, it is locked into this track, kind of like railroad tracks, so that it really can't deviate. And you make your mark on this side, but it really keys off the back of the track. In other words, you're constantly measuring from the back to the front, and that's your keeper piece. But for those of us who have used a table saw for years, I'm really used to that. There are many cases in which I want to make a small rip, maybe a 2-inch rip all the way along a piece of plywood or whatever. And so I'm really interested in the waist side cut, in addition to making a large panel. And the selling point of a track saw with a plunging saw like this, like a Kreg or a Festool or some of the others, is that in theory you should be able to get a furniture grade cut because of the way the track is designed and the anti-splitting strip that's on here, as well as the anti-splintering strip on the saw itself, and the fact that the saw can plunge in so you don't have to start way off your piece of plywood and shove it in with the blade spinning. But that presents a problem, so let's take a closer look at this end. One of the beauties of a track saw guide like this is that it has this soft strip that gets trimmed to the right width the very first time you use the saw. A track saw like this, like the Kreg or Festool or some of the others, you really should read the manual because you can kind of mess things up at the very beginning if you're not careful, and these tracks are not inexpensive. So this is a soft material, and since the track saw is used to measuring from this side, they're really not set up to use a waist cut. So if you want a 2-inch strip on your plywood, basically the edge of this is on the inside of the blade. So if you try to put your mark here and line the saw up with your mark, your cutoff piece is going to be shorter by whatever the width of the blade is. In my case, it's 2.2 millimeters. So for those of us that want to have strips and want to cut an accurate waist cut, we need some sort of a guide that builds in the thickness of your blade to this measurement, because this will give you the edge if the piece is measured from the back side of the track down to here. But then it will end up being short or narrower by the thickness of your blade. So a couple of ways to overcome that. You can measure it, but that's a pain in the neck trying to measure 2.2 millimeters. There was a company called Strawbite in the UK, and I bought a couple of these from him because I thought it was an innovative product. So his product is 3D printed, and you buy the one that matches the thickness of your blade, in this case 2.2 millimeters. And it slips under the track, and that way you can put your mark. If you say, well, I want a 2-inch piece, you put your 2-inch mark here. And this makes accommodation for the thickness of the blade. And it's pretty tricky in that he even has a couple of tiny alternate markings on your tabs in case you want a bevel cut, which will change the location of your mark because of the way the saw pivots. So it's pretty innovative product, and I just wanted to support him, so I just got these in the other day from the UK. However, a couple things. These are 3D printed, which means you really shouldn't leave them out in the sunlight. Definitely not on your dashboard because they're heat printed and the heat can kind of mess them up. And they have to be stuffed underneath this track and then pulled out. that I'm not a super fan of. And they still key off this soft edge. And this edge can at some point become a little unreliable because it's really there as a splinter guard. It's really not part of the metal. So this is what I came up with as the gauge that I'd like to use. Basically, it's a little piece of scrap plywood and a little piece of scrap clear plastic. And what it does is it goes on top of the track. However, this piece of plastic is flat down on top of the work, and it keys off the edge of this extrusion. It doesn't care about this little splinter track on here. So if this gets chewed up or scratched or dented or abused in some way, this doesn't care. And this gets cut by the saw, so it's not started out as a measurement. It's actually a mechanical slice that was made in here by the saw itself. So it's keyed against the metal and the saw, and so it should be highly accurate. So I'll give you a little bit of a hint as to how I made it, and maybe you can make one yourself for your track saw. As a little bonus, on the Kreg, there's a separate Allen key that you use to combine two of these tracks. And the saw was pretty cool in that it has a receptacle in the handle for two of the Allen keys for the saw, but nowhere to put this little Allen key for the track, and so I'm sure that I would lose it. So I put a little hole in here just to keep track of the Allen key for putting two of these tracks together when you want to rip a long piece. So here's a piece of scrap plastic. I keep these little offcuts just for special projects like this. So I was able to square it up with a 90 on the table saw. And you can see you can shove it in under the track and align it with this hard mechanical edge here. So I put the piece of plastic underneath, and I took some Gorilla duct tape and I taped it on all three sides and locked it in solid with this aluminum track. So here you see that piece of plastic, and it's locked up against this edge on the bottom. And now we're going to take our track saw, not here on my nice workbench, but over on the sawhorse, and we're going to cut into this piece of plastic just an inch or so. We just want to dig in. We don't want to trim it all off because then we would have lost our gauge for the blade thickness. So we'll pull that saw in there, make that cut, and it will be something like this. So now we have a piece of plastic with that exact cut where our blade is and referencing off this edge here. So now what we need is just a little piece of scrap wood. Mine would happen to be just a little bit of 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood, and it needs to have a nice 90 cut on it so that it can key up against this same extrusion and extend an inch or so past where the cut is. And in mine, I actually super glued it first. When it was set up like this, I just super glued it on there, waited for the glue to set up, and then I countersunk a couple of screws in there so it's mechanically as well as glue locked in so it can't move. Then over at the table saw, I trimmed away the excess plastic that I didn't need, all that big plastic, and with the bandsaw and the table saw, I hogged out enough material on the wood so that this plastic would sit flat on my cut surface and this piece of wood would ride on the extrusion. So you have to remove a few millimeters of wood material so that this plastic can be tight down on your work. And in my case, in addition to kind of hogging this out here, this doesn't have to be a super precision piece of work, but I cut another little groove in there because of this strip of plastic here. I didn't want it riding up. I wanted this to basically sit flat. Put a little circle in there for my thumb, and like I said before, a little spot to put this little Allen key so it doesn't fall on the floor and get lost or get into the bottom of the carrying bag for the saw. Okay, so let's go over to the sawhorses and we'll make a quick demo cut. First thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean up this edge and trim it because this has not been cut with a saw like this. So already you can get a hint of the accuracy of this saw. The thickness of this strip is very uniform, but it's just a cutoff. We don't want this piece. So now I just dialed up 2 inches on my little combination square. Put a small mark here, and I'm going to put a small mark on the other end. So this is our waste piece. This is the cutoff that we want, 2 inches, not this measurement here. So the track saw is not set up to just cut a perfect 2 inches on this side of the edge, but with our jig we can make that happen. So there is the track lined up with my mark, but in this case that would give us too narrow of a cutoff piece. So I am going to use my little homemade jig here, and I'm going to put my line right on this part of my little jig here and on the other end. And now you can see the gap between my mark and the jig, and that's the thickness of our blade. And of course, if we need multiple strips all the same width, then we just reset our combination square between this metal edge and the edge of our work, and all the strips will be the same. Beautiful. 2 inches, 2 inches, and 2 inches. Perfect. I'd also like to show the quality of cut on an actual cross cut. This is birch plywood, very, very splintery. So I just put my square here, squared up the track, and I'll make a quick cut. So here's our piece. There was our rip, there's our cross cut, our 90. Lines up great. Beautiful finish on that. I could put some edge banding on that, and that would be a finished shelf or side of a cabinet. A furniture grade cut. So I went with the Kreg tool. Some things I really liked about it. The Kreg and the Festool have the blade on the left hand side. I'm used to cutting with my right hand, so I really wanted a saw that was set up like this so that I could push the saw in that direction. It has a nice chip guard here, fine tooth blade, lots of settings. I won't go into a lot of details. There's plenty of videos about the Kreg and the Festool and the other brands. And I love the slow start, and I love the plunge effect on the saw. I just didn't think I'd get my money's worth out of the Festool. I'm not a professional full-time carpenter, so it didn't make sense to spend that much money. But the Kreg is reasonably kind of in the mid-range of prices, mid to low range, so it was great for me. So if you've never seen these little jigs, I'll put a link for Strawbite if you're interested. He makes them for a number of different saw setups. But if you're like me and you just have to make a DIY version of what you think will work, I hope I explained enough without actually making this. so that you could see how this works. It uses the saw. You really don't have to take any measurements or get out your calipers. It's using the mechanics of the track and the saw to make the groove in the guide for the blade. You can see I kind of marked it with a marker so you can see it in here. A little nice place for the Allen key, and it sits flat on the track, and this sits flat on your work and makes following the mark easy peasy. Make your own DIY jig. It works great. Thanks so much for watching. Hope I can see you right here next time.